Our series, The Apostle Paul Sailing to Rome. Welcome to all once again to our series on Paul. And today we're going to see Paul leaving Caesarea on his way to Rome. So in the last video, we ended where Paul had appealed to Caesar, which obligated the governor Festus to send him to Rome so his case could be presented before the emperor. A little bit before that, when Paul was in Jerusalem, we remember that Jesus had promised to Paul that he will also witness in Rome. And as Jesus always fulfills his promises, he even provided transportation to Paul under the Roman protection. So our governor, Festus, put a man in charge of that trip. He appointed a centurion by the name of Julius. A centurion oversees usually a cohort of 100 soldiers, but it's likely, however, that he selected a smaller contingent of soldiers to accompany him on this journey, because all he needed was enough soldiers to guard Paul and any other prisoners that were being transported to Rome. In the book of Acts, Luke describes Julius as a kind and civilized man who had a high regard for Paul. Julius and his soldiers then took Paul and the other prisoners and boarded a cargo ship returning to its home port of Adramyttium, located in Asia Minor. The ship was a smaller one and stayed close to the coastlines and stopped at many ports along the way. Although Paul was traveling as a prisoner in chains, both Luke and Aristarchus were allowed to accompany him. Luke's presence with them is implied by the use of the pronoun we in Acts 27. He possibly joined them as physicians for Paul and the other passengers. So the ship sailed from Caesarea to Sidon, which is about 70 nautical miles and takes about 1 day. While the ship was in port to unload and load cargo, Julius allowed Paul to disembark and meet with some friends that he had in the city. Soon after, Paul was back on board and the ship headed along the coast of Cyprus and arrived at the port of Myra. Myra was one of the chief ports for the fleet of Roman wheat transports, so Julius secured passage on a grain ship and transferred everyone to this larger ship heading to Italy. It was unusual for these transports to be on the water that late in the season, because the sailing conditions were poor, the strong winds, as the strong winds continued blowing from the northwest, which made it difficult for the ship to make good progress westward. Due to this harsh weather, the captain changed course, and instead of heading for the port of Cnidus, he elected to go west toward Cape Salmon on the eastern edge of Crete. This way he could use the island as a natural barrier. But the wind was still so strong that their progress was very slow and difficult. So despite all, they managed to reach the harbor of Fair Havens. That is a city near the city of Lasea, on the southern shores of Crete. While they were docked at Fair Havens, Julius met with Paul and the ship's captain to decide what to do, since the wind made sailing difficult and they were fast approaching also the end of the sailing season on the Mediterranean. Sailing became very dangerous after September, even ceased completely from mid-November to mid-March. Luke mentions the Day of Atonement had already passed, so which means that they were now into early October. They were all in agreement not to continue on to Rome and needed a place to dock for the winter months. But Fair Havens was not quite a suitable harbor for wintering, so the captain wanted to risk sailing on to Phoenix, another harbor about 40 miles further, where they could dock for the following 5 months. Paul warned them against this plan and he suggested instead that they stay put in fair havens. We can read this warning in Acts 27:10 when Paul says, "Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only to the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Despite the wisdom of Paul's warning to stay put until the spring, the centurion agreed with the captain that they should try to make it to Phoenix. The wind shifted and began to blow from the south, so the captain thought it was a good time to go, so he decided to take his chance and set out. While they were sailing close to the coast, suddenly a violent wind rushed down from the top of the mountain, Mount Ida, which is about 8,000 feet high. Luke describes that wind as a northeastern wind, which refer for that part of the world to a hurricane force winds. In Acts 27:14 we read, "But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon." Euroclydon is a cyclonic tempestuous northeast wind which blows in the Mediterranean mostly during fall and winter. And the ship was overwhelmed by these winds and was swept out to open sea toward the small island of Cauda. While sailing toward Cauda, they gained control long enough to take action to secure the ship, wrapping the center hull and around the deck, making the hull sturdier so it could endure the constant pounding of the waves. They took many actions, dropping a drift anchor to slow down the ship and also to provide further stability. They were scared that the ship might be driven further south in an area of shallows and quicksand off the coast of Cyrene in North Africa. And none of their effort could bring them safe sailing. They were at the mercy of the storm's fierce winds. Between the powerful winds, heavy rain, darkened overcast sky, steep swells, and crashing waves, navigation was impossible. And it even went from bad to worse. And the next day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard, possibly meaning that they dismantled and tossed overboard the main yard, which is the mast used to support the mainsail. They were in a state of desperation. Without the main rigging, basically the crew forfeited control of the ship, and they just surrendered their fate to the storm. Any hope of surviving the journey was gone. The ship was continually tossed about for many days and nights under a sky with zero visibility and gale force winds. They were sailing blind. The stress and anxiety from this constant state of fear made sleep impossible, and they even stopped eating. They were now lost at sea. So Paul took center stage and spoke directly to the captain and centurion, saying, "You men should have just followed my advice not to sail away from Crete." It became across as, "I told you so." As a result, it forced them now to listen to the message Paul had for them at that time. He told them, "Take heart. Nobody will die, but the ship will be destroyed." How could Paul make such a strong statement that guarantees that no one will die in such a desperate situation? Paul's confidence comes from a message that God had sent to him by an angel during the night, likely while Paul was praying for everyone's safety. The angel also assured Paul that he will testify before Caesar, just as Jesus had promised. God will spare and rescue all of the crew and passengers as an example of God's grace, also as a direct answer to Paul's prayer for their deliverance. In Acts 26, we can read, "But when the 14th night was come, As we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country. After they had been drifting helplessly across the Sea of Adria for 2 weeks, imagine, a slight change in the sound of the waves made them to cast a line into the sea with a lead weight at the end of the line to check the distance to the sea bottom. Since it was the middle of the night, they had no way of seeing where the land was or how close it might be. So to avoid smashing into the rocking coastline, the crew dropped 4 anchors, halting the ship's forward progress. When the boat stopped, they all prayed for the light of dawn. Some of the crew were too anxious to wait for the morning and planned to sneak away in the dinghy during the night. But Paul found out about this plan and told Julius, the centurion. Julius had grown to trust Paul without hesitation, and he ordered the soldiers to cut the ropes and drop the empty dinghy loose from the ship. At dawn, Paul, who had become a leader, urged them to eat because they had gone too long without food and they needed strength for the coming days. So Paul took some bread, thanked God, broke it and ate, and all 276 people on board ate. After they ate, there was enough daylight for them to see a bay with a beach where they could attempt to reach. So what they did, they cut loose the 4 anchors, and as the ship approached the shore, the ship jolted to a stop as it ran aground on a sandbar. They were all getting ready to leave the ship, and as they needed to swim, well, all prisoners needed to be unchained. The soldiers guarding them feared that they would attempt to escape, so they decided to kill all the prisoners. But Julius would not allow them to do so because of his respect for Paul. All 276 passengers then jumped into the cold water, and all made it on shore, cold and wet, but alive, just as Jesus promised. Some of the island locals came to help the shipwreck survivors, and they learned that they had landed on the island of Malta. The inhabitants of Malta spoke a dialect of Punic. Some also spoke Latin and Greek, so some would have been able to communicate with the shipwreck survivors, although they primarily would have conversed with one another in their own dialect. So the local built a large fire to help the survivors get warm and dry. Paul, as a servant leader, helped them out by gathering wood to keep the fire going. As he was carrying a bundle of sticks, and nestled among them was a snake he didn't know, and when he tossed his bundle into the fire, the snake reacted to the sudden heat and latched onto Paul's hands, as Luke describes in Act 28:3. So the locals saw the snake biting Paul's hands, and they interpreted it as a divine judgment. They said to one another, because they saw that he was a prisoner, so this man is no doubt a murderer. Even though he was escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. So the locals looked closely at him, they observed him closely, expecting Paul to die. But Paul did not even swell up at nothing. And when nothing had happened, well, they concluded that he was a god. Luke tells us that close to the place they came ashore, there was a large estate owned by a man named Publius, who welcomed a group of survivors and allowing them to stay with him. So we were talking about hundreds of people here, so he must have has a lot of space. So they stayed with him, and Luke refers to him as the chief man of the island. His name, Publius, and Publius' father had been bedridden with a fever and dysentery. So 3 days after arriving at the estate, Paul prayed for Publius' father and even healed him by laying his hands on his head. The word spread quickly about Paul's ability to heal, so that all those who were sick on the island came to see him, and he healed them. Paul and the other survivors remained on Malta for 3 months, when ships could again sail on the Mediterranean. Julius arranged passage for his soldiers and prisoners on another Alexandrian grain ship that was wintering in one of the harbors of Malta. The residents of Malta provided all the supplies for their new friends as they prepared for Rome. So next time we will see the group boarding that ship on their way to Rome, where the remaining of their journey will overall be a much smoother sailing. Thank you all for watching. See you soon, and as usual, God bless you.